Okay. Hello, Trailblazers. Today I've put together a little guide on the different damage archetypes in Honkai Star Rail. Just a quick overview, based on what we currently know. So in Star Rail, there are a number of ways you can deal damage, but the three main ones are going to be crit damage, damage over time, and break damage. Most commonly, you're going to be using crit damage. Let's just continue. So here I've listed a simplified version of the damage formula you'll be seeing. The main components are the base damage you deal, which is based off of the skill multiplier in your traces, the stat your attack scales off of, which is typically attack, and then additional damage effect found in skills. Next up, you have damage boost multipliers, which will primarily come from buffs you apply to the character. This part of the multiplier will also account for damage reduction debuffs. And then finally, you have the target side multipliers, which mainly consists of your enemy's defense multiplier, their elemental resistance, their vulnerability from debuffs, damage mitigation buffs, and an additional multiplier for whether or not they are weakness broken. In the future, the target multipliers will be left out because this affects all damage, almost all damage equally. And an important notion for when you're team building is that defense reduction in the form of defense shred debuffs on the enemy or defense ignore buffs on your units will be one of the most valuable buffs you can get. It will scale pretty well up until 100% def reduction. You cannot ignore more than 100% of an enemy's defense. So the most common type of damage you'll see is crit damage, which is, or just the general damage, which is what happens when you select in a skill. Your basic attacks, skills, ultimates, and follow-ups will all be dealing crit damage. And so all units have access to this damage type. When building for it, you're primarily focusing on crit rate and crit damage. And then you'll also be focusing on the scaling stat for a unit, which is typically attack. All units will have a base 5% crit chance and a base 50% crit damage. The main way a crit damage equation is going to differ from the rest of your damage is the crit damage multiplier, which is just multiplying your crit damage stat The majority of characters you find in the game will be dealing crit damage, or crit damage focused. Not much else to go off of. The next archetype would be damage over time, or DOT. This causes enemies to take damage at the start of their actions. But do keep in mind that not all damaging debuffs count as a DOT. DOT specifically refers to bleed, wind shear, shock, and burns. That does not include the damages that is dealt by freeze or entangled. Primarily on your DOT characters, you want to build effect hit rate to a point. The point at which it stops becoming useful varies depending on the base chance to inflict a debuff, but you only need to get enough to reach 100%, unless your unit has something that scales off of effect hit rate. Currently, I believe all DOT units scale off of attack, but also you can get some pretty... you can get a pretty sizable DOT effect from using break effect, which we'll talk about more in the break effect section. Damage over time uses the standard version of the damage formula. It is not affected by crit, so putting crit stats on your DOT unit will not help them. Currently we have 5 DOC-centric units in the game. The top 2 being Black Swan and Kafka. Black Swan can stack a special variant of Wind Shear that will stack up to 50 times, while on the other hand, Kafka can, on her own turn, trigger any DOT effects on the enemies, which allows you to, on command, deal damage to them with your DOT characters. The other 4-star Nihilities, they all help by applying debuffs. They apply their own DOTs, they also can apply vulnerability debuffs. In particular, Sampo can sort of be used in the Kafka Swan setup, because Sampo can trigger wind shears from Black Swan, or he can also stack... while also stacking his own debuffs pretty strong. Luca is also interesting because he works very well as a break character. This is because physical has a very strong break effect, which we'll go over later. And he can also trigger his own bleeds inflicted by the break effect. And the final method, or archetype for dealing damage, is Weakness Break. In-game, each enemy will have a toughness bar that will reduce as you attack it. Upon depleting the toughness bar to 0, the enemy will enter the Weakness Break state. This will delay their action by 25%. This will also have several element-based effects, based on the element of the character used to break the weakness, which is applying a debuff and dealing break damage. Break-related damages use a modified version of the damage formula, which account for special elemental multipliers, the character's level, and the max toughness of the enemy you broke. In terms of debuff, only Bleed and Entangled will account for the max toughness. Instead of using... Instead of using damage bonuses, such as the elemental-related ones, break damage uses break effect to scale. And then the target multipliers done to break damage are mostly the same, but does not take into account damage mitigation buffs, which would directly decrease the damage. I don't believe these buffs are too common on enemies, and most of them are dispelled if you weakness break them. And of course, pretty much all break effect centric units are going to scale completely off of break effect. You won't need to build any attack or crit stats on them. I suppose you could for extra damage, but you mainly want to focus on just break effect. As I mentioned before, each element has its own slight variation on how it breaks. Physical will deal massive damage both on break and through its debuffs. Fire does larger damage on break, but its debuffs burn isn't as strong. Ice is really strong as crowd control, but it doesn't scale well off of break effect. You won't be dealing too much damage with it. Lightning is the reverse of fire in this case. It has a weaker break effect hit, but stronger DOT application. And then wind's a bit in between that. It has a mid-range multiplier on its break effect damage, and while it has a normal damage multiplier for its DOT, it has a stacking effect up to 5. Typically, you're probably not going to be stacking too much wind shear through this, but if you use it on bosses, it will immediately apply 3 stacks of wind shear, which is essentially triple damage. Or at least that's how I interpreted it. Quantum and Imaginary are a bit more special. They have weaker damage on break, but they make up for it with additional action delay, which goes on top of the action delay you apply through the normal break. And this action delay also scales off of your break effect. But additionally, Quantum will deal massive damage through Entangled, assuming you can stack the 5 hits on it first. And Imaginary is also special because its Imprisoned effect will not damage the enemy whatsoever, but it will reduce speed, and it does reduce their action value by a massive amount. Additionally, there was recently added the Super Break Damage mechanic. Super Break Damage is a special mechanic triggered when you hit weakness broken enemies. It uses a modified version of the break damage formula. This one does not take into account elemental multipliers, and it also accounts, instead of the enemy's max toughness, it accounts for the toughness damage you dealt of the attack. So pretty much any toughness damage that would have gone into a weakness broken foe becomes more damage for you. This takes the normally heavily backloaded break damage and allows you to activate it consistently. Also, additionally, it allows you to basically turn any character into a DPS, because just all you need to do is stack break effect on them, and pair them with Harmony Trailblazer, whose backup dancer will enable the super break damage. Of course, this is much stronger on units who can reduce more toughness. The break roster is still fairly new, but we've already got a lot of strong characters. In particular, Harmony Trailblazer and Ron May form a really strong support core. Both of them boost break effect by a lot, and Ron May will increase the toughness reducing damage you deal, which helps both break enemies faster, and it will increase the super break damage you do from Harmony Trailblazer's backup dancer. And pretty much with these two characters together, you can turn just about any unit you want into a break DPS. Though, of course, you'd want to use the actual break DPS in this situation. Additionally, as I mentioned, Gallagher can actually deal a lot of break damage through Harmony Trailblazer, since he has an enhanced basic with massive toughness reducing damage, while also being a very SP positive abundance unit and only a 4-star. So he should be easier to max out and invest in. So some people might question, why does this matter? Why can't I just use my crit DPS hypercarry for everything? And the simple answer is that as the game progresses, we're going to be getting content that is going to require different strategies to work. For example, we've been seeing more units with this safeguard damage effect, which significantly reduces all the damage they receive until they're broken, but leaves them much more vulnerable to break damage and super break damage. And also we've gotten enemies like the little summons from the death meme, and also Beyond Overcooked, which have hit counters that increment when DOT is triggered on them, letting you shred through their passive effects quickly. And as the game continues, we are going to see more variety, and they're going to require you to team build better in order to get through the game. Well, that went a bit quicker than I thought. This is just a simplistic overview. I mean, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is just use the characters that you want. But obviously, as the game gets more difficult, that might not cut it anymore. And it's not because the game is getting harder, it's just because they're requiring more knowledge and strategy. Well, I hope you all do well. This was just a little test of my ability. It was really fun putting this all together. I hope to see you all later. Stay safe, Trailblazers.